Okay. And as Bonnie said, there'll be two opportunities. We'll take a break right after we sort of define some terms and check in with you and make sure you're understanding what's going on. Next slide. So here's the team we have today. Bonnie is our principal planner, and this is her project. I am here as kind of a host and the outreach engagement person. And we have Amy Geringer from Kimley Horn and Eileen from Y2K Engineering, who are consultants on this project. Next.
So we're excited to introduce you to this concept of adaptive streets. It's gained traction throughout the world, actually, over the past couple years. But we realized as we started looking back at some old photographs that we've really been starting to implement some of these strategies from years ago. So what we want to do, yeah, thanks. So this was an example of a planter and seating that was used in parking space for parking day back a few years ago. All right, next slide. Project purpose. The purpose is to identify low-cost strategies that enable the city to temporarily adapt the function or use of portions or all of the roadway to address changing needs by the community. There's a need for the city to be able to have a way of more quickly implementing some of these ideas. And the adaptive streets is the application that's temporary. So if in fact a strategy isn't working, it's not there permanently and we can easily make it go away. So important here, rapid response to perceived needs by the community and the city staff, temporary and low-cost methods, and quick adaptation. Next slide. So here are some of the examples of what we've done in the past. Mostly you can see here that we've done bike parking in parking spaces along Mill Avenue. Here are two examples. A shaded pavilion, again, in parking spaces, and even barriers that temporarily restrict use of the street so that we can provide for more pedestrian and bicyclist activities. Next. This project started back in June 2020 when our commission asked us to look at opportunities for doing some temporary adaptations in the first outbreak of COVID. We saw across the nation that people were looking for ways to have more room to walk and bicycle, to be able to get outside. We knew that restaurants needed temporary pickup, and they also wanted to have a little more space to extend their dining. So that shift in community needs prompted us to look at what we were calling then open streets as an approach for social distancing in response to COVID. Next slide. So we looked at what the community wanted, and this is important. They wanted an ability to slow down traffic so that streets were more friendly to bicyclists and pedestrians. In some cases, roadways were closed, and that was typically done in a lot of cities in the US as well as Europe. Often expanding bike lanes and signage that more clearly identifies where bicyclists can go and where cars can go. So more room to walk and bike. Next. You also wanted a safer street. So here are some examples where painted bulb outs made the crossing distance at intersections or crosswalks shorter for the pedestrian and bicyclist. Also adds a beautifying and interesting design aspect to our community. We also find that there's a lot of overlap in our different projects for transportation. One is Vision Zero that the city is committed to. Here you can see that even by slowing speed limits, it addresses traffic issues as well as improves neighborhood traffic calming, and just the typical cones that you often see on streets as a means of restricting some of the right-of-way from auto traffic. Important in all of these is we want a safer street that's adaptable and allows all users to safely use the street. Next slide. So we were also addressing business needs, and I'm sure you've seen some of the adaptations that we did during COVID in terms of extending restaurant space. This was pretty common again in many cities and is still in use. Next slide. And then there was placemaking, which always enhances a community. We saw generally a higher demand for space that enables community gathering. Here you can see in other cities, they were even using the streets for exercise, being able to socially distance and still be active in the community. Next. So adaptive streets, what is this really? What is this guide that we're going to prepare? This is going to be a guide that illustrates the strategies that we're going to be talking to you about. Not only how they are applicable, but also where is it appropriate to place these. The guide, in addition to providing strategies, is also going to clearly define process. So we anticipate that you may have questions about how does this work? How do I make this happen in my neighborhood or in our business district? We're working on that. We are working closely with all departments of our staff. This is something that's evolving as we're working through this project. So we don't yet have all the answers, but we're here to talk to you about it, see what will work, and how we can best roll this out. It's important for us to get the process right. So that's what we're here to do today at this first public meeting. So far, the project, we've hosted 2 focus groups. First with city staff, bringing them on board for what we'd like to accomplish. Then we had 1 meeting with neighborhood representatives, special events, and business owners. So the comments from those meetings are online, and we used those to help us understand how we might roll this out to the broader public in this meeting today. We're here where we're in analyzing and creating the strategy toolbox. We'll hear your comments. We also have an opportunity for a meeting on January 29th, which we'll describe it in more detail. And then there will be another meeting when we're ready to evaluate, and we'll come back to the public to show you what this guide might look like and get further input from you and comments. We hope to be complete early summer 2022. Next slide. So what are adaptive streets? We're going to bring in our consultants now. Amy's going to talk to you about some of the strategies and examples that we've seen as we've done our research and how they might be appropriate for the city of Tempe. And while you're listening, we want to make clear that this guide is specific to Tempe. So while we're showing you a lot of examples, not all will necessarily be a good fit for the city. That's part of our discussion today. Amy?
Great, yeah, thanks, Bonnie, and thanks for a lot of that context. And so yeah, Bonnie did a great job of teeing us up on kind of where this concept came from, maybe where the city is right now, where in terms of adaptive streets, or what we maybe formerly are working towards calling adaptive streets. So in the next bit here, we're going to provide a bit more detail about what we mean by this term adaptive streets, as it is specific to Tempe. And we're going to provide a whole bunch of use cases and examples that we think are adaptive streets. And really the goal, as Bonnie said, is to understand and get everyone's reaction to, are these things that we want to include in our Tempe adaptive streets guide. So if we go to the next slide, please. So first, at the beginning, we talked a little bit about the project purpose, and Bonnie emphasized this idea of kind of quicker responses, more temporary measures. And so it was pretty important, and this has actually been quite an adventure for all of us to really try and hone down on what is that definition that we want to use for adaptive streets in Tempe. And so where we're at right now is that, so adaptive streets, it's a change to the public right-of-way. And so our public right-of-way is really looking all the way, it's the sidewalk, it's the curb, it's parking spaces, it's the roadway, any medians, and so it's a pretty more, it's not really just the roadway. So it's changing that public right of way. It's something that's implemented temporarily and relatively quickly. We know that sometimes larger permanent changes take a lot of time. And so this need of, we need something that we can do it quickly. And COVID, the initial round of COVID kind of showed, we can do this, we have done this, these are the kind of rapid responses. An adaptive streets is something that includes a new feature in that right of way to change how some or all of it is used. And Bonnie showed some good examples. We'll show some more about what we mean by kind of changing how that right of way is used. And another thing that's really important for this in terms of its application in Tempe is we're looking for these to be location specific, strategies in response to a specific need. And so this isn't something that we're looking to say, any road that looks like this does this. It's really going to be reacting to what are some of those needs that require that faster response, or a temporary response. And it's really going to be based off of what we hear from residents, community members, businesses, potentially other city departments outside of just transportation of kind of specific locations. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So go to
I'd
next.
say also, Amy, that this is not intended to replace any of our existing programs or standards. So we have a traffic calming program that's for permanent traffic calming. We have other programs that address different needs. This is specifically to be used in an adaptive, temporary way.
Thanks, Bonnie. And so that's a great tee up to the next slide, which is what is not an adaptive street? Because I think that's where we've spent a lot of time saying, this thing is, would we consider that part of our guidebook? And so we've been able to work through that with both the community and the city. And so some things that we're not talking about in terms of adaptive streets, as Bonnie mentioned, some of these permanent changes. So one thing we do think is that this kind of activity may help make the case for a permanent change if that's something that ends up being desired, but anything permanent, that's not adaptive streets. Certainly nothing that will be put in this guidebook or actually implemented would impact safety of any user of the roadway or impact accessibility. So all of that is part of those design considerations. And Bonnie just teed up the neighborhood traffic calming guide. Nothing that we're going to be looking at related to adaptive streets will conflict with that or override that. That's a very established and specific item that the city will retain. And then again, it's not going to be replacing any existing programs. Neighborhood traffic calming is one of them, but there's a whole bunch of other ones related to special events or food trucks or temporary extension of premise. All of those things are staying intact, and we're looking at ways that the adaptive streets can kind of work hand in hand with those, but certainly are not replacing them. Okay, next slide, please. And so just a plug, and we're going to do questions here in just 1 second, but we really want to emphasize that it's important that everyone, this is where we need kind of everyone's input to make sure that as we work through this definition, as we show a lot of examples of what could be, we need to know what's right for Tempe. What are the things that we want to have in our toolbox for Tempe? And so we'll present a bunch of things here. We also have, and we'll talk at the end, a survey that has even more photos that says, if you like this, you don't like this, where could this work? And so it's really important that we understand what goes into this guidebook so we can continue to build them out and build up that process to be able to use it. Next slide, please. So I think this is our question break. So this first question break, and Laura will help me through it, but we really want, so we do have a second one. We really want to focus on questions about that definition and of adaptive streets. Do people understand? Does this make sense? And relate to the project purpose. And so we'll open I think Laura will throw some questions out that we hear related specifically to some of these some of this upfront material.
Yes, and I think the first one, and it's an important one that we're hearing, is how quick is quick? What is meant by a fast intervention or quick response?
Yeah, so I'll take a first stab, and I think between Bonnie and I will tag team some of these. And so that, I don't think we can give a specific answer. There's not going to be, depending on what it is, it's going to be different. It's certainly looking to make it faster than something that would be a permanent change. And usually with some of those more permanent capital projects, those require that it needs to go into the capital improvement plan. There needs to be specific funding identified for that specific project. And so those tend to be longer. And so we're looking to at least make it a quicker process than that. That being said, different applications are going to take different amount of time based off of circumstance. And so I don't think there's going to be a clear threshold of this shall take 1 month from when we identify it. But that's something we'll also be working through as we are able to talk through the process a little bit more as we continue on.
It also depends on how long the implementation is designed to be in the street and where it's going to be implemented. Is it at a school street, or is it in a residential neighborhood? So again, as we start defining what could be the adaptation, we want to then be talking with our staff, identifying who might be working on these requests and what that process is. So then I think when we come back to you at the next public meeting, we'll have a little better definition of what temporary means and quick means, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order because I think this sort of relates more. The next question, can you talk about the difference between this and a special event?
Yeah, we can do that for sure. And so special events, there's some very well-known processes for special events. Things like if that require, I guess if we're, for example, the Festival of the Arts in Mill Avenue, there are processes for that street gets closed down, how things are done. And so this is not changing those processes. A special event is also usually something that's in a shorter time frame than we're really looking at for these adaptive streets. And so something that's going to be there for under a week, that's probably not that's not the intent of what these adaptive street strategies are. Those are going to be more of those special events that need to change for a very specific amount of time, and then we're going to go back to regular programming. So that's how Bonnie, do you have anything to kind of add related to that?
No, I think that's clear. Thanks.
Yeah, I think another kind of maybe special event is there's already a city process for the neighborhood block party, right? And so that's something that Adaptive Streets is not going to be changing or really interfering with that process. And so again, it's this idea of maybe some of these other non-established needs that aren't related to something very specific that's already been identified.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. This one, how will equity be included in the citizen participation process to educate neighbors and open on opportunities for using adaptive streets in areas of historic inequity? This one probably is more directed in our direction since we do citizen engagement. Well, first we have to develop these guidelines, and we have put the information out in a number of our traditional places. But as we develop the guidelines, it will be important for us to go to those neighborhoods that maybe haven't traditionally had access to this kind of information. And we'll do that maybe through direct mailing. We may have, a special event in their area to sort of introduce the concepts. But all those things are still being developed.
Yeah, and I think the one thing just to focus on there is, right, that's part of the process that we are still absolutely working through. And that's something kind of once we understand where everyone's landing with what we want to be including in this guidebook, that internal city process and that external public process are things that we're still working to identify, and we'll certainly come back to everyone here and the rest of the city to be able to talk through.
This one's also sort of related. Well, maybe we can even consider it already answered. It was about public participation with these applications. And yeah, it just kind of will depend on some of these things. If it's a strategy that a neighborhood wants to use, we'll have to tailor that public participation and that engagement opportunity with the type of application or strategy. So let's see, any more? I'm looking for raised hands. Oh, and I see one. Okay. Meryl, I am unmuting you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, let's see. I've got a few questions. One, a very good example of the adaptive reuse was what Arizona State University did for their homecoming, where they closed university for pedestrian use only, which was a great idea. But also, is there a chance for any one-way designations with adaptive streets? Oh, you can unmute me and I'll listen.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, no, thanks. And so I have two part. So the first, the idea behind the homecoming, that while yes, the spirit of that is certainly adaptive streets, that actually is one of those examples of a special event. And that's something that there are processes that the city have to handle those specific things. And so those types of events, we aren't going to be engaging with quite as much as part of this process because there is such a good process in place already. However, the spirit behind this idea that we needed more place for people to walk, or people to gather and so those kinds of things we'll actually get here in some use cases in just a little bit, that I think will help provide a little more context behind that. But that the spirit of that with that need for a right of way is exactly what we're talking about with adaptive streets. And then the other part of your question related to one-way designation, that certainly is something we can consider. We haven't actually, so today is where we're starting to really line up where we've gotten in terms of what might be those possible applications. But feedback just like that is what we need right now to really come up with that menu of options. And so we'll take that one and kind of vet it through the process as we keep going. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just add that something like changing traffic direction is a bit complicated, because if you're restricting it to one way, what other street is offering you the opposite direction? So those things would have to go through our city traffic engineer. But again, at this early stage, we're open to ideas about what you might feel would be beneficial in terms of adapting our streets. What kind of adaptations do you think would be beneficial to your area of town?
Okay.
We move on?
Yeah, I think we need to get moving. We've got lots of examples to show you, and we can take questions again at the end.
Alrighty, so early on in the presentation, Bonnie went over some specific needs, and those were kind of at the national level. We saw a lot of photos around, during these times, we heard that people, or I guess nationally, different municipalities heard people wanted safer streets, people wanted more room to walk and bike, businesses needed more things. And so we wanted to make sure we understood from Tempe specific, maybe what some of those needs are. And so some of our initial focus groups, as well as just looking through plans and policies to really understand what those needs are. But rest assured, this is still the forum to be kind of telling us what those needs are, and part of our survey is related to those. And so we welcome some of that. But to provide where we're at right now, what are some of the needs that we have heard specific to Tempe for demands to that public right of way? And so it's really right now boiled down to these big six, and you'll see this kind of as we walk through some of the examples about which of these needs are related to some of these different strategies. And so these include vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles and scooters, transit, public spaces and businesses. So we go to the next slide, please. So I'm not going to read all of this, and we'll certainly post this and have this available, but here's some flavors about what we're hearing from what are those needs of these different categories. And so from a vehicle perspective, there's a need for efficient traffic flow. There's a need for safe intersections. There's a need for appropriate speeds. And so those are the kinds of things we're hearing and trying to make sure that we have a good suite of adaptive some potential strategies to address some of those. From pedestrians, there's a need for sidewalk improvements that we've heard. We hear needs related to safety, of course. Shade and cooling is one that we'll talk a little bit about. Generally, this idea that we need accessible infrastructure for those and not just for all ages and abilities. So we can go to the next slide, please. Some of the things we're hearing related to bicycling or scooters, there's a need for some protected or separated facilities. There's need for bike share and bike parking. There's need for wayfinding. And again, always the undercutting here is safety. In transit, some of the things that we've heard that are needs that might be addressed by adaptive streets. Some more dedicated space for transit, more bus stops, shade at bus stops. So more around some aesthetics. And so that's what we're hearing. We've heard so far with transit. And then public space, we're hearing a lot of, again, around this aesthetics and public art. And we really want to create a place, and we want to create places of community pride. Green space, green infrastructure is something that has been a need. Generally kind of a wayfinding or information, that's something that's kind of a demand on our right of way that we need. And then from a business perspective, some of the needs have been related to, exterior services that we saw a couple of good examples, and we'll see some more around, especially with during this kind of COVID time, this idea that it's been wonderful to be able to have businesses expand into the street and allow them to continue. So that's something that might continually be a need. Balancing parking. And so that's one, working through some of those competing demands on the right of way. All right, so here we're going to throw out some specific use cases that our team has come up with in terms of what might be a use case for adaptive streets. So one thing to note here is that, especially kind of this second thing, this items to consider. And so I teed up earlier on that adaptive streets is not going to be a blanket thing that happens on all arterials or all collectors or anything. So it's very much specific to the location that the needs identified, what are the surrounding land uses, what are the other demands on the roadway, what do we have to work with in terms of the right of way to help see that an adaptive street strategy can actually be successful. And we certainly don't want to be suggesting things that aren't considering the surrounding context and other competing demands. And another part of that is just the surrounding stakeholders who else might have some stake in that area. So this first use case we have here is this need for an enhanced pedestrian environment at intersections. So we have here 3 potential examples of different adaptive street strategies that could address that need. Again, how you choose which one is right for that specific location has to do with those different items to consider. And so it's going to be a very kind of individualized process. But some example potential adaptive street strategies for this are, Bonnie actually pointed out this one earlier, some temporary paint and barriers for intersection improvements. And so she talked here a little bit about, how this will reduce the amount of the crossing distance. And so it's kind of improving that pedestrian experience. The second one too, temporary paint. So here we don't have those vertical barriers, but it's just temporary paint to increase awareness of an existing crossing. So that could be an adaptive street strategy for this need. And another example here is movable planters or temporary vertical options. to increase awareness of a new intersection improvement. And so maybe we've made a permanent change and there's a need for temporary awareness in using some of these adaptive street strategies. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Here is another suite of potential strategies for the use case of the need for wanting more space to bike. And so some of the options for adaptive streets might be shifting vehicle parking to temporary bike parking. This is an example of something Tempe's done before. This is not necessarily a whole new thing, but it's formalizing that process of identifying that need and seeing if this is the type of strategy that might, from a temporary basis, support addressing that need. These two in the middle show this idea of temporary shared or open streets. So it would be putting up some sort of, whether it's signs or barricades or planters or things that actually temporarily kind of restrict certain uses of a street. And so we saw a lot of early photos around, a lot of places did this during COVID because there was a need for people who wanted to be outside and they weren't driving anymore. We wanted more room to walk and bike. So this idea of maybe temporary or shared streets. And then our third example here on the right is movable barriers to create additional space for biking. And so this might be a temporary strategy for the demand of wanting more space to bike. Okay, next slide, please. So this one is looking at the potential use case if there's a need for more space for transit or for more people who are riding transit. And so some of the different adaptive street strategies, one, maybe there's an opportunity to do a temporary bus only lane. And obviously looking at those items to consider and looking at other demands, looking at land uses, looking at some of the visions and plans that the city is looking at. Might that be something that is part of our menu of options for adaptive streets? And a second option here is really looking at some temporary shade at transit stops. So that could be using temporary shade structures or something, especially maybe during summer months, where it's not permanent. And so we're not permanently changing the right of way, but we are putting something there to address some of the needs. And that would be an adaptive street strategy. So next slide, please. All right, and then this is our fourth use case. And so the need here would be, there's a need for more room for outdoor business use or dining or shopping, or a need for more public space that kind of responds to the neighborhood and that idea of placemaking. And so some potential adaptive street strategies to address this need. We see on the left here, a temporary shift of parking and vehicle lanes to support some of these outdoor business uses. Temporary shift in excess parking to put things like benches or greenscape. And so I think Bonnie said earlier, this is actually an example of something that is a Tempe photo. And so having some of this opportunity to consider adjusting, and it's not for parking for a temporary point, it's for green space or seating. And then this third one here on the right is this idea of temporary painted murals into transportation solutions, and really honing in on that placemaking and kind of community culture. And is there a need, and is there an adaptive street strategy that might support that?
So I'd add here, if you could go back to that slide just for a quick minute. For instance, in the painting in the intersection, a lot of communities find that this really builds stability in their neighborhood. Having a design in the intersection pretty much prompts people to pause or go a little bit more slowly or pay attention to their surroundings. So those can all be a means of slowing traffic. And again, I think what I've seen in the research I've done is there's a real pride of place when neighborhoods have this opportunity. Okay, next.
Yeah, and so I think that we've gone through a lot of examples, a lot of photos. So we're going to take another pause. And I've been seeing some questions come in just for some questions about this concept, some of these use cases, and so we'd love to hear from folks.
Yeah, so our first one is, what is an example of of what a neighborhood would use this for, and how would it be funded?
Okay,
Well,
so
do you want to take that, Amy?
yeah,
Start.
I'll take it, and we'll start with the part that I can easily answer, which is the funding. And so that's a to be determined. That's part of those processes we're working through. Right now, we're in the concept phase, and this is kind of a plan, and we will be working through some of those more kind of process related decisions around funding. And so stay tuned at a later time for some of those answers. So in terms of an example of how a neighborhood might use this, I think so a potential need that might come out from a neighborhood is a need for, I think this last one that Bonnie was talking a little bit about is a good one, a need for maybe placemaking or kind of a temporary thing to bring people together for community identity. And so some of these different options around painting or putting in temporary aesthetics could be an adaptive street strategy to support neighborhoods. I think another one could be the temporary need for more space to walk and play. That could be something. And so looking at some of those different strategies that we put out there in some of the previous use cases around what might be some of those strategies to temporarily shift how the roadway is used to provide for more public spaces.
I think also most all of our neighborhoods have neighborhood schools. There might be an interest in better drawing more attention to the crosswalk, perhaps with paint. In some cities, they actually close a school street just during the hour when children are arriving and the hour when they're leaving. They found that this reduced accidents. It actually increased biking and walking substantially. A lot of the cars were actually parents dropping and picking up kids that was creating the traffic congestion. So they had an improvement in air quality. So some of those things have been documented other places, and we might want to consider some of those. So I think these can be utilized in some of our new innovation hubs where we've got changes in uses, perhaps a mix of mixed use areas, industrial, commercial, residential, multifamily, where you've got a lot of different people utilizing the street. They may come together and look at some of these opportunities for adaptation. And again, on budget, right now, what's important is to say, is this needed? What would it look like? What kinds of things could we do? I want to be clear that some have talked about Marianne Corder grants. Those grants are specifically for permanent neighborhood improvements, but there are other types of grants that may be available to communities, and there may be some city funding down the way. We won't know any of that till we really get through this process and outreach.
I think you answered this person's next question about grants being used.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I will give the example though that she states. She said, for example, if there are residents parking in a no parking zone, could a neighborhood get a grant to put in a painted area that would emphasize that it is no parking? That's a little more of a temporary potential. I don't know about a grant though for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case. We'll have to think. I don't want to do a rash response to that. So I thank you for that, and we'll take it and we'll kind of work through our process and see if that is an applicable use case. But from the perspective of funding, again, more to come. We know that this is an important topic. It's probably generally even from the city side when we get a lot of questions from city folks, and so we will work to that and come up by the end of our project with an answer for that.
Would anyone like to be unmuted? I'm only seeing Meryl's hand and I'm guessing that's from earlier. Okay, here's another one. The idea around schools is fantastic. Would love to see that focus in a lot of the school areas. The parking issue is by the school that I mentioned. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions that we can answer? We don't have too much else. We just have a couple of different plugs for more opportunities to hear from you, but
I did see in the chat some additional questions here. Will these interventions be done in response to crash data or only citizen suggestion? The interventions can be prompted by city staff or by the citizens or businesses in the community. Typically, data-driven processes are used when we're doing permanent interventions. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be available information could be used, but in this temporary process, we wouldn't be going out and hiring consultants to do specific testing. That would be more in line with neighborhood traffic calming and other programs.
yeah, I mean, and I think one thing to emphasize, if there's a safety challenge, that's not something the city's going to take on a temporary basis. And so while adaptive streets may be something that gets engaged in that process, it certainly is something that will be a more permanent discussion.
Right.
Here's another question. Some of the places that could test these kinds of interventions are major arterial and collector streets, especially in north-south streets. How will these needed interventions work under this proposal?
That's a really broad question to something we're trying to be very location specific on. So I think the best way I can answer that right now is that we're hoping to understand what types of those interventions or those strategies you think might actually be applicable. What is the need driving that? And then we're really looking forward in this project to put together that process to identify those that are most compatible depending on the type of roadway, what's surrounding that roadway. So I think it goes back to not wanting to kind of have a one size fits all answer through this process.
Okay, we have another one. How will data be collected before, during, and after temporary changes to measure impact?
That's an excellent question. We do not have an answer for that yet. We are still working through the process component of it. And so I think that's a great data point for our team as we work through that over the next about 6 months, 5 to 6 months. And so thank you for thinking about that. Data is important, and we will keep that in mind as we work through that.
Again, each neighborhood's different. Some of that might be neighborhood collection of data or observations. As we, again, get further into defining what the intervention will be, we'll have a better sense of what we might want to measure. And again, there are cases where a temporary implementation can work so well and everyone's so happy with it that it could lead to discussions of becoming permanent. So you can keep that in mind. Also, I'd like to mention that temporary comes in a lot of different packages. Temporary can be seasonal, as we discussed about shade. Temporary can be different times of day, only on a weekend day, only on at hours where school is beginning and ending. So this whole proposal is really broad at this stage so that you can give us feedback about what ideas you have that could be helpful in your community.
Okay, and this next one, you've kind of touched on it, maybe even answered it, but in case there's more that needs to be added here. It would be useful to have a plan that would allow a transition from adaptive to permanent. the original intent would not be permanent. But that is, if something works so well as adaptive, that people would like to see it become permanent after loving how it worked out as adaptive.
Right. You know, if we can make everybody happy in a neighborhood, that's terrific. And, you know, sometimes you don't know how something will work until you give it a try. So definitely, if we get a lot of positive feedback and there's interest, we can look at a more permanent opportunity. Again, that would need additional vetting by our traffic engineering and other staff to be sure it's appropriate as a permanent solution.
Okay, anybody else? I'm not seeing any raised hands. Nothing new in the chat or in the Q&A.
Very good. Okay, well, and thanks everyone for all of these questions, because these have been really good questions, and we're excited that there's interest and a lot of people are already thinking about this. So we're looking forward to hearing a lot more and coming back to you with hopefully some answers. So if you go to the next slide, then.
Next step. So we have in January gone out to a variety of city commissions, Transportation Commission being our primary outreach, because they did in fact request this type of intervention. But we've also gone to the Sustainability Commission, Neighborhoods Commission, Development Review, and again, wherever there are people who are interested in learning more, we will go out and address their questions. We're looking to assemble something of a toolbox over the next 2 months so that we can bring back specific recommendations and how they might be implemented. March and April for defining in more detail our street processes, and then coming back to you in and the commissions and council in April and May to present the draft implementation design guide. So I think what we want to know is what we're looking to find is how might we create a toolbox where maybe some of these objects that could help in doing temporary modifications might be available through the city. We'll also look at funding sources, how we might be able to assist with funding. So we need your input. We have 2 options after this meeting. First of all, if you can provide feedback through our survey after this meeting, that would be very helpful. But I really want to let you know about our transportation open house that's coming up on Saturday, January 29th. This is in the southeast corner of the Tempe Public Library parking lot, where we currently have a park and ride. And so that is a new use of this part of a parking lot for our rapid city bus service. While we're out there talking about adaptive streets, we're also going to be displaying 3 prototypes for our transit shelters. So you'll be able to sit in them, walk around, take a look, talk with our consultant group about the transit shelters that we'll be placing beginning in late summer this year. We have Mobility Hubs project. Robert Yabez will be out with his team talking about mobility hubs as well as transportation demand and some of the other programs that he is working on currently. The ADOT is going to be available to answer some questions about the Broadway curve and that widening. Braden Kay and some sustainability staff will also be available. They'll be talking about the climate action plan. And as you know, this really integrates with our transportation planning because we're always looking for ways to make cool streets, make walking and cycling more safe during the hot temperatures of the summer. I think he's also bringing out some trees that will be available for giveaway and plants, and he'll be looking for feedback on the climate action plan. And also, cul-de-sac is a development on Apache that's doing the first car-free residential development in Tempe. And they have some interesting ideas, and we'll be showcasing some of those as well. Did I miss anything on Saturday? The event becomes more broad as we talk about it, but there will be a lot of people available for you to talk with and ask questions about all of these projects on Saturday, the 29th. That's from 9 to 11 a.m. And at the same time is an event called, I always want to call it Comic-Con, and that's not it. It's,
FanCon.
yes.
FanCon.
So there's a lot of fun activities at the other end of the parking lot, if you and your families are interested in attending.
Thanks, Bonnie. Nice to wrap up. Anyone else before we close it out today? If not, thanks. Thanks for spending your lunch with us, and hope to see you on Saturday, the 29th.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.